Good morning and welcome to this IEECP lunch seminar. Today we will hear from the Enefirst project, an EU-funded project from the Horizon 2020 program, and our presenter is Jean-Sébastien Broc. The floor is yours, Jean-Sébastien.
Thank you very much, Marine, and welcome to everybody. So today I will talk to you about the Enefirst project that is funded by the Horizon 2020 program and that deals with the energy efficiency first principle. And we will see today the objective is to show what this principle means in practice. So maybe as an introduction, I will not go into the details. I recommend you, if you are interested in the background of this concept, to look at the first report. You have the link on this slide. But I guess Marine will add it below the YouTube video. The idea of this slide is just to remind that this concept, this energy efficiency first principle, does not come from nowhere. It comes from, let's say, almost 30 years of experience in developing not only energy efficiency programs, but also different type of demand-side management programs and other resources. With these, let's say the same common point is that to consider that we can act on the demand of energy, not only adapting the supply to a growing demand that we could not do nothing about it, but that we can definitely master the demand. That's the main objective of this principle, and also thinking in a different way in terms of energy planning. And that's what I will present today. You see that there were different steps in this story to consider all that. And maybe you are familiar with some of these keywords. So to complement that, here is the definition we have adopted in the project to the energy for the energy efficiency first principle. We called it efficiency first principle because for most of us, energy efficiency is connected to end-use energy efficiency, which is only one part of the demand-side resources. So we thought efficiency first was a way to raise the attention of people that it has a bit a broader scope, and that it includes demand-side, also demand-side resources. And this definition was developed. It's not because we don't acknowledge the official definition that is included in the governance regulation. You have the reference on the top right of your screen. It's because for this research project, we needed a definition that made more explicit some of the aspects that are useful when we analyze what it means to implement this concept. So first of all, there is this idea of setting priorities in decision making. As I just said, the fact that demand-side resources are not limited to end-use efficiency, but also to that includes, for example, demand response, and this is well covered in the governance regulation definition as well. Maybe something that is less explicit in the governance regulation definition is that this principle is also about adopting a broader perspective, and especially a societal perspective, meaning that the investment, because it's about making a decision at the end about possibly about an investment, should not be seen only with the eyes of the investor, but also considering the other impacts, multiple impacts it can have for the society as a whole, and taking into account a longer term than the investor perspectives. Another point that is well addressed and clearly explicit in the governance regulation definition is that this decision of investment is usually connected to policy objectives. There is a policy to promote this investment or to support this investment, to guide it. And when I mentioned the issue of multiple impacts, it's clear that it would be impossible to consider all the possible impacts that you can imagine each time you make a decision. So that there is a selection of impact that you will include in your cost-benefit analysis, and this has to be connected to the policy objectives, and the same for the time frame you take into account. Another very important point, and that is not maybe for us at least enough explicit in the governance regulation definition itself, but it is very well explained in the governance regulation, because the energy efficiency first principle is mentioned at several points in this regulation, is that it's not something that you do just for once in a long time. That's something that should be systematic, meaning that it should be a change in the way decisions are taken, in the culture of making decisions. And that's not only at EU level, that's at all levels, so meaning also national, local levels, and even, let's say, end user levels. And the last point is the equal opportunity aspect. Maybe you are more familiar with the word or the term leveling playing field. And again, that's something that maybe is not so explicit in the governance regulation definition. So that's why we highlight it in the definition for this project. So now showing two examples from the two extreme sides, let's say macro and micro level, to see what it could look like to think in terms of energy efficiency first principle. So at macro level, let's say you in the process of energy planning for a country, thinking about energy efficiency first principle would be to make a fair place in the scenario that in the scenarios that you are considering for the demand side resources, so that the way the demand side resources is let's say as well perceived as the way for the supply side resources. And also, as I said earlier, taking into account multiple impact. And in terms of modeling, this means also that probably you need, maybe you don't need new models, but you need to integrate different models, which some models that are better to model the supply side, other models that are better to model the demand side. And you need to combine both to get, let's say, the interactions between both and how demand side resources can help to meet the overall energy needs. At micro level, let's say a building level, so we can take the decision of end users thinking about replacing his or her heating system, and you get an incentive through a policy that is promoting renewable energy sources for it. And here we can have, we can illustrate that through two examples. On your left, you have, let's say, a policy that will look at the efficiency first principle, and that's the case of this example that you have on the bottom from Ireland, where there is a kind of precondition for the subsidy for the heating system to be eligible. So you need first to have a minimum energy performance of your building envelope. And in that case, you ensure that the sizing of the heating system will be appropriate and not oversized, and that will also reduce the load on the energy system. On the opposite side, on your right, you have a case where we could say that's efficiency last, where the incentive will be based on the amount of rest heat you produce. And in that case, you could have installers pushing end users to choose the maximum size, and you will get many oversizing, and at the end that will give some negative impact on the energy system. And let's say, for example, if you think about heat pumps, it can mean much more constraints on the at least on the distribution networks, and even at the transmission network if it's disseminated to many end users. So that was to introduce the concept. Maybe very briefly to remind about the objective of the project. We have, let's say, a combination objective from defining the concept up to assessing different scenarios and ways to implement energy efficiency first. And this is with the ultimate objective to develop policy guidelines and proposal in concrete terms to support policymakers and decision makers in the implementation of the principle. And all that is done with a focus on energy use in buildings, which means that we focus on buildings, but also on the energy system that supply buildings. So it means also we consider electricity system, the gas system as well, and district heating, for example. The way a quick slide about the way the project is structured. We have two main streams. The one on your left about assessment that is based on modeling, and the one on your right that is more qualitative about policy analysis. And both are merged at the end in case studies and preparing the policy application. And we are more or less at the middle of this figure. We are reaching the middle of the project right now. The team that does this project, so the project is coordinated by IEECP, and we have, let's say, 7 partners in total. Here they are distributed in policy analysis and modeling team, but in practice, every partner contributes to all parts of the project. But it is true that they have major roles on the different parts. So you have RAP and BPI leading the policy analysis together with Central European University, and Fraunhofer SI leading the modeling part with the support of TU Vienna and IRIS. Now, what we've done in the first part, among what we've done in the first part of the project, we analyzed 16 examples. So here, that's just the list so that you can see the type of examples we have seen. I will not, of course, detail all of them today. What I can do is to explain how we have tried to classify them so that it gives a better idea of what does it mean to implement efficiency first in practice. So on your left, you have 4 squares that represent the different categories of provisions, what we call provisions to implement efficiency first, with 2 dimensions. The first one is either the provision is in front of the meter or behind the meter. In front of the meter means that it's something directed to, let's say, the utility, the energy companies, decision made by energy companies, for example, about networks or other energy infrastructure. And behind the meter is when it's about dealing with decision made by end users mostly. Then the second decision is the second dimension between general and investment is whether the provision is a general provision. So it's, for example, part of a regulation like the regulation for energy markets, or whether it is directly linked with a specific type of investment. And that was, for example, the case in the example from Ireland that I mentioned earlier, where you have a condition to subsidies. And then on your right, you can see 6 shades, the 6 shades of color of the efficiency first principle. And it means in terms of requirements, when you define a policy or a regulation or a policy framework to favor the implementation of the efficiency first principle, it can be made with different level of requirements, going from a simple possibility to implement, so allowing efficiency first, and in that case, that would be mostly voluntary programs or pilot projects, up to strong requirements. And that's the case, for example, in the example I presented earlier, where you have a clear requirement for the subsidy to be eligible. So kind of first preconditions. And here you have 2 examples. I will not present the one on the right because it's similar to the one I mentioned earlier, but that's just to see what an example behind the meter and related to investment look like. And on your left, you have another type of example, which is in front of the meter and with general provision, where the DSO in UK had the possibility to experiment programs where they will procure demand-side resources instead of making investment in the network. And especially that applies especially for areas that are under constraints, so where there can be some constraints as at time of peak load, for example. And these 2 examples have been presented in a webinar by the people in charge, the persons in charge of these programs. So it was a very interesting webinar, and if you have not seen that, I recommend you to have a look. And beyond that, we also identified for the 18 examples that we did not analyze because they were already analyzed in the literature, and some of them are coming from other interesting projects like the SENSEI project where IEECP is also involved. To conclude, where we are now, we have just recently published in August a report about barriers to efficiency first. And here one of the challenge when looking at the issue of barriers was to look at what distinguishes the barriers to efficiency first compared to classical barriers to energy efficiency. Because of course, overcoming these classical barriers is part of implementing efficiency first, because if you cannot do the energy efficiency options, you cannot implement the choice of prioritizing demand-side resources against supply-side resources. But there are also other type of barriers that are more specific to the implementation of the efficiency first principle, and some are rather general, like the lack of expertise, knowledge, and awareness and understanding of the principle itself. But it's also some are more specific, like the habits and practices of especially of stakeholders from the supply side to disregard demand side options in their decision making or energy planning. And what we found from the surveys that was done to support this report is that there is a clear need for cultural change, as I mentioned at the beginning, and also to provide some support to stakeholders, decision makers, policymakers, in terms of resources, examples, and experience sharing. And that's what we try to do through this project. And the ongoing work that we are doing this month and next month is screening policy areas to determine the specific policy areas and type of policy instruments we will focus on for the rest of the project, so that we can enter more into details for the analysis and preparing policy guidelines. So here you have an idea, you have listed a number of policy areas that we are considering, and we will make this month some interviews with policy experts to select from these areas what could be the most promising to have impacts when implementing efficiency first. And to finish, here is the timeline. So as I said, we are about half of the project. You have on the left what we have delivered already, and on the right what will come soon or a bit later. So next month we will deliver a report on policy transferability between countries, and a first report on the modeling approach that has been developed in Enefirst. And later there will be more stakeholder engagement in terms of case studies and policy guidelines. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was interesting to you.
Thanks, Jean-Sébastien, for sure it was. And I will add the links of everything you mentioned below the YouTube video. Any question for Jean-Sébastien from our team?
Yes. Hi, Jean-Sébastien. Thanks for the presentation. I have one question. Actually, it's more about the work you are doing now on that. Yesterday, the State of the Energy Union was presented with all the information, and the annexes on the NECPs were included, so on the evaluation of the NECPs. I don't know who carried out the evaluation of the NECPs, but while reading, browsing randomly through some countries, I saw that when they were coming to the energy efficiency first principle, a lot of the countries were getting an okay from most of these evaluations. But when we read a bit deeper on that, I saw that the cases they considered as energy efficiency first compliant somehow were pretty loose, I would say. So in most cases, we did not have really the implementation of, with the concrete examples you showed us now on the energy efficiency first principle, which really you put the demand side in front of the others, but it was more on a more generic part, like that. I saw that in some evaluations, for instance, they were writing that, yes, the energy efficiency in buildings is put as one of the priorities, and next to the other RES policy. So they consider this was compliant with energy efficiency first principle. So it's not a question, it's more like a remark or suggestion. Should we maybe inform a bit the Commission a bit that these things could go a bit more in detail with the NECPs?
Okay. Well, I think the Commission is perfectly aware of that, but maybe that's not completely reflected in their assessment of the NECPs, because you should also remember that the governance regulation was adopted late in 2018, and that the draft NECPs were due by January 2019, including a consultation already. So it means for most of the member states, when the governance regulation was published, their NECP was already well advanced, I would say. Then they had 1 year to that there was one semester of exchange between the member state and the Commission. The Commission reviewed the draft, they made recommendation, and then the member state has further, let's say, 6 months or so to prepare their final NECPs. But that's you don't completely change what you have prepared earlier, especially because that's part usually you try to connect that to your national policy process, so there is connection. So it's not because it's not reflected in the NECP that there is nothing done in a country about the principle, and also the principle is quite new, so I guess it's not so easy to envisage what from your previous practices was already in line with this principle and what should change. So that's I think we should see that as another type of transition maybe, and that that takes a bit of time. So of course the faster it happens, the better. But yes, that requires also sometimes for people to get this principle in their own language. I mean, professional language, and habits. But overall, when we looked for the examples, we found examples in several countries, very interesting things. Of course, we looked at more recent initiatives because the programs or other schemes that were in place for many years, most of them were already analyzed in previous publications. But yes, there are many examples that countries can get inspiration from.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Sébastien. Any other question before we close this lunch seminar?
Yeah, yes, I have another question. Martijn talking here, Jean-Sébastien. I was a bit confused about the definition of energy first principle, because it specifically highlighted that it is looking at a societal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also added that it's not only private, but also societal perspective. But
Mm-hmm.
don't you agree that it should be either or, and it cannot be both?
No, I think indeed that's exactly the point. That's to reconcile the private and the public perspective, if I use your words, and that's where when it's needed. Well, when the both are converging anyway, maybe there is not a need for a big public support. Maybe it can happen, let's say, by itself when there is no big barriers and that the two perspectives are aligned. But I don't think that most of the case. In most of the cases, there would be let's say different interests or different priorities, and the idea is to recognize that, and that's where probably there is a need for public support, and also maybe to think a bit differently how to fund the investment. So where the money should come from. It's clear that if the choice is positive, that the choice that would be beneficial from a society point of view would be detrimental to the investor, then there should be a policy to bring some kind of compensation or to change the conditions so that it's also beneficial to the investor. I think that's probably that's a way to see that. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Clear.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Sébastien, and thank you for the questions. We can then close this lunch seminar and yeah, enjoy this video.